Hello, welcome to this video. My name is Rhianna, and today I want to talk to you about 3 amazing short story collections that I read recently. And these short story collections are all different and distinct, but I think something that connects them all is that they're all a little bit weird. And I really enjoy weird fiction because it usually allows me to see the world from a perspective that I had never even imagined before. And as well as being weird, these short stories incorporate aspects of magical realism. They could also be described as a bit speculative. There are also some scary stories here, some stories with quite profound meanings, or stories that don't really make sense, but you have to try and dig to find the meaning, which can be quite fun because you feel like a bit like a detective. And I'm going to talk about my 3 favourite short stories from each of the collections, and then at the end of the video I'll talk about my favourite short story from the collections, all of them, which I'll talk about it because it's my new favourite short story ever. So first I want to talk about She's Always Hungry by Eliza. So what I liked especially about this collection is that every story was so distinct and individual. So every time a new short story would start, I would have no idea what to expect. Some stories are set on other planets, some are set in the real world, some are set in the past. It's just so imaginative that it really just wakes your mind up. One of the short stories I loved in the collection is Company Man, and on the surface this is a love story, but there's a lot going on underneath. And alongside this love story we also get this returning motif of a circus, because the main character keeps dreaming of a circus. And I love it when a short story has like 2 parallel ideas and at the end they connect. Also, it's a love story, but at the end there is a twist that really gets you thinking. I also love it in short stories where on the surface everything seems normal, but then there are little hints that the world the characters are in is not exactly the same as the world that we're in. So in this story there are a few hints like that. For example, the main character says she might get sent to a labour camp. There's also a short story in this called The King, which is the most crazy short story I've ever read. It's just so fun. I think this short story, it felt like Eliza sat down and was like, let's just write the most wackiest, funnest short story I can think of, because it's about this alien or like other being that works in a corporate office and sort of sees the ridiculousness of this corporate office and then eventually ends up ruling the world in this post-apocalyptic future. And it's just bizarre. And to give you a sense of the writing style, this is a quote. It says, "Your kind cannot truly love one so lowly as me. This was true, but I could love him in the same way a farmer might love a really big cow or something." I love it when a story leans into the absurdness, if that's a word, the absurdism of life, because life is ridiculous. And it can be sad and painful, but it also can be incredibly funny and surreal sometimes. I also really enjoyed a story in this collection called Extinction Event. This is about a scientist that discovers an alien plant that offers a solution to climate change, but human flaws make the operation faulty. And I thought that was very topical and relevant to the time, and also leaned into the theme of humans being their own worst enemy. The next short story collection I read is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Machado, and I was interested to read this because I've seen it recommended a lot on YouTube. It seems like a lot of people who make videos about like good short story collections to read seem to mention this book. And I think a highlight for me was the very lyrical, poetic writing and the naturalist themes that were interspersed with magical realism. So you get the sense that everything is real and like the world that you know, but actually there are some like little things that make it a bit different. For example, in one of the stories in this collection called The Husband Stitch, it's about a woman's life story, really, but in this world women have these ribbons connected to them, and if they lose their ribbons then they die. Also, what I thought was really cool about the short story is something would happen to the narrator and then there would be a part in parentheses that would speak to the reader. So for example, there's a part in parentheses that said, "If you're reading this story out loud, give a paring knife to the listeners and ask them to cut the tender flap of skin between your index finger and thumb. Afterward, thank them." So the parentheses bits give an equivalent experience, asking the reader to try and really empathise with what's happening to the narrator. Another short story I loved is called The Inventory. Initially, I wasn't sure. So initially, this short story appeared to be a woman just talking about every sexual experience she'd had in her life. And I was like, oh, that's fairly interesting, but it's not like that. It's not really awakening my brain that much. But then we get these little hints throughout the story of a pandemic occurring. And then we realise that this pandemic is quite extreme and people are dying. In fact, most people are dying. And the narrator continues talking about all these sexual experiences she's had in her life. But by the end of the story, well, that's a bit of a spoiler, as the story progresses, more people die. I think what the story was trying to look at is how we still try to be intimate with people and still try to connect with people, even in the darkest times, even when everything seems to be falling apart. And I really liked how creatively it was done. I also really loved the story The Residence, which is about a woman who goes to an artist retreat in the mountains, because I've always idolized the idea of going to the mountains and like staying in a hotel with other creative people. But this story sort of looks at how insufferable that might be. And the main character slowly goes a bit insane. You don't really know if what she's seeing are hallucinations or if they're real. And I thought it would work well as a novel. Like, there was so much story within this, and I really, such a page turner. I enjoyed it so much. But I will say, in regards to this short story, there were a couple of short stories that I enjoyed and I was intrigued by, but I didn't really understand. Most especially the last story, called Difficult at Parties. There's a part in this short story where the main character goes to a party. I got that bit. But the rest of the short story, I wasn't really sure what was going on. I kind of love that in short stories sometimes, because, like I said earlier, you have to try and be a detective to try and discern what is actually happening. But I feel like a few of these short stories, they do sort of leave you a bit on the fringes sometimes, and they don't quite let you in, and you have to really push to try and be like, what is actually happening here? But I did love a quote from Difficult at Parties, which is, "I do not even struggle to speak. The spark of words dies so deep in my chest, there is not even space to mount them on an exhale." I just thought that was such beautiful writing. Okay, next I want to talk about Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez. So I was excited to read this one, is that the writer is from Argentina. A lot of the stories are set in Buenos Aires, and I am really trying to read stories that are set in other countries, places that I've never been, to try and gain different perspectives, to try and see what is being written around the world. And I really enjoyed the fact that a lot of these stories were set in Buenos Aires. It's not a place that I've ever been to, or not a place that I know a lot about. And I felt like, as well as being entertained, I was really being informed through the stories about a culture and a country that I don't know a lot about. And these stories were creepy. I think they're really suited to the spooky season, but they're also quite grotesque, and I think if you are a bit squeamish, some of these stories are maybe a bit difficult to read, because there are some really stark images in here that did make me a bit queasy. And so my favourite story within this collection was a story called The Dirty Kid. This is the story that the collection opens with. And we meet the narrator. She lives in Buenos Aires, and she lives in a rather poverty-stricken area of the city, whereas she actually lives in quite a nice flat. So even though she lives in an area with poverty, she's doing quite well. And I found that contrast quite interesting. And the narrator sees a homeless woman outside her flat often, and that homeless woman has a young boy with her, and the narrator takes the boy for ice cream and forms this kind of connection with the boy, and then eventually he goes missing, and the story progresses from there. And the story made me think a lot about the power an individual has to help someone, whether that power is big or actually rather insignificant. And I think it's one of those stories that I'll never forget and that I'll always think about, and I think it does inspire more empathy. Another short story I loved was called The Neighbour's Courtyard. I think this is the creepiest from the collection. So in this short story, the narrator thinks she sees a young boy chained up in her neighbour's courtyard, and she's not sure if it's an hallucination. Well, actually, she's pretty sure it's real, but the people around her think this is an hallucination. And as the reader, you're asked to question whether it's real or whether it's fake. And this character also has a history that you learn about, where she used to work in an orphanage and she got fired. And the ending image of this short story I will never forget. It's very grotesque, and it sears itself on your mind. And I also really enjoyed Under the Black Water from this short story collection. This is about a detective who is trying to solve a murder, and it's about how people can abuse power. It's about whether you can really trust the people in power. It's very atmospheric, very dark, reminded me of something like True Detective. Okay, and now that I've spoken about those three collections, I want to just end this video talking about my favourite short story from these three collections, and that goes to She's Always Hungry from the short story collection She's Always Hungry by Eliza Clark. This is my favourite short story, maybe ever. I think it's just so imaginative. So we're introduced to this very unusual setting. It's a Viking-esque world where women are the people with the power. So the men are referred to as, for example, Our Mary Samuel. So that's a guy called Samuel, he's Mary's son, and they refer to him as Our Mary Samuel. And I thought this was so interesting because I've read a lot of books where the women have been subservient to the men, for example, something like The Handmaid's Tale, but I've never read something where that idea is flipped. And I think for me, it highlighted the necessity for equality. It doesn't work with men in power, it doesn't work with women in power. You need to have the balance, you need to treat people fairly. And it's just such a unique and clever piece of writing that, yeah, definitely recommend that short story. Okay, thank you very much for watching this video. Let me know if there are any short story collections that you really enjoy, because I would love to read some more. Do you have any favourite short stories of all time? Would love to read them. And I'll see you in another video soon. Bye bye.